In the years after Bobby's death, the house he loved had become a smelly zoo. The dogs roamed freely indoors, urinating and defecating on the rugs and furniture with abandon. There was even poop from the turtle Carruthers on the rugs, said a frequent visitor. As a Christmas gift one year, Lem Billings gave Ethel a baby pig, whom she named Billings, and whom she allowed to run loose in the house, making a mess and leaving a horrible smell. Ethel finally gave Enna the responsibility of making certain the little porker was fed and taken outside. They tried to feed it on the patio and make it go to the bathroom outside, said Noel Fell. It was wintertime, and about 2 weeks after Ethel got the pig, someone left it outside one night and forgot it, and the next morning they found it frozen. I'm not sure whoever left the pig there didn't do it on purpose. Mrs. Kennedy should have given it away, but instead it died. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. We are going to read 2 chapters today in The Other Mrs. Kennedy. Now, the first chapter is entitled Horror Hill, and it is more of the same that we were reading about last time, more about how she was so abusive to the staff. Particularly, we're going to talk about her deep, entrenched dislike for the nanny. Enna was a woman who'd been with them since the kids were little, who Bobby loved. But Ethel does not like her, and the real reason is because the children favored Enna. Well, obviously, she's the one who raised them. But if they were excited about something or had a bit of good news, they would run right past Ethel and into the arms of Enna to tell her all of their news. They just adored her. And Ethel's jealous. You know, it never popped into her pretty little head to possibly spend some time with the kids so that they wouldn't run past her to go to Enna. But it's always easier to blame everybody else for our problems. So she's on a campaign to get rid of her, although the kids are extremely insistent that she not let Enna go. But since when did Ethel put the needs of the children before her own? So we'll see what happens there. And then there's also talk about the way she would run through cooks. She had a real problem keeping a cook around. And then the next chapter we're going to read is entitled Bad Boys. So we're going to get a little bit more information about that. So this is going to be a really, really interesting episode. We may have an opportunity to get to this last little chapter entitled Zany Playgirl, which is about Ethel and the weird, immature things she wanted to do with her adult friends that included vandalism and practical jokes. So if we don't get that today, we will get it later this week. But I would love to be able to tack that chapter on. It's not very long, so let's cross our fingers. Let's hope we can get there. If I could stop talking and start reading, we might. So let's go ahead. Chapter 103 is entitled Horror Hill, and it begins this way. One member of the Hickory Hill staff who truly got under Ethel's skin after Bobby's death was Enna Bernard. A black woman from Costa Rica, Enna was utterly devoted to Bobby, and he considered her our treasure, often exclaiming, "If it wasn't for Enna, this place would fall apart." Enna had begun working for the family in the early 50s, when Jack, at Bobby's behest, had used the influence of his congressional office to secure a green card for her. Later, as a publicity gimmick, Bobby arranged for Enna to accompany President Kennedy on an Alliance for Progress trip to her homeland, where she was accorded a virtual hero's welcome. Later, Bobby brought Enna's daughter Josefina to the United States from the Bernards' hometown of Heredia. Enna always had a bright, cheerful room on the 3rd floor at Hickory Hill and traveled with the Kennedys to the Cape and elsewhere. When Bobby died, Enna was heartbroken. At every memorial service, she was in attendance, usually standing with her arms around one or more of the children, tears in her eyes. Ethel, though, had come to loathe the aging nanny and housekeeper. She was actively thinking of sacking the woman, who was approaching 70. Noel Fell said that when she was hired, the outgoing Sandra Renzi had told her, "Make sure this doesn't get back to Enna, but Mrs. Kennedy wants to get rid of her so bad that you'll start taking over some of her duties. And this'll give Mrs. Kennedy a reason to let her go. She can tell her she wants her to retire." The Cold War between Ethel and Enna added to the high level of tension in the household. The friction also touched off frequent skirmishes between Ethel and the older children, especially Joe and Kathleen, who were adamant that Enna be retained. They loved and revered the heavy-set woman who had watched over them from the time that they were toddlers. She was a beloved presence in their lives, someone who had always been there to cuddle them when no one else was around. Later, as they became young adults, they often went to her for guidance and advice instead of to their mother. All of the Kennedy women would have given anything to have had Enna to take care of their own children when she was in her prime. As Pat Kennedy Lawford once said, everyone who wondered how Ethel could raise 11 children knew when they saw Enna in action. When Bobby was alive, Ethel had smiled and tolerated Enna, knowing how fond he was of her. But in truth, she had always felt jealous of her. It was typical of Ethel, always so possessive of Bobby, to harbor such feelings. She had felt the same way about Bobby's longtime secretary, Angie Novello, too. Since Bobby's death, Enna had become the self-styled major doma of the household, which infuriated Ethel. When Ethel had one of her tantrums, or did anything embarrassing, Enna gloated. Noelle Fell, who witnessed this ongoing battle between the two women, recalled Enna saying, "The thing I miss most about the senator is that he used to put her in her place. This would never go on if the senator was alive. He would take her by the shoulders, sit her down, and give her a talking to. He'd tell her what was expected, and she'd do it." It was clear to Noelle that Enna loved Bobby and hated Ethel with a passion. Enna could be highly critical of Ethel. She said she thought Bobby had done too much for her, coddled her. On one occasion, Enna confided to Noelle, "You know the reason why Mrs. Kennedy has so many children? Because that was her way to make sure her marriage stayed together." Noelle said Mrs. Kennedy would get ticked off at Enna and yell, "Get out! I don't need you here!" Mrs. Kennedy felt Enna was a thorn in her side because Enna knew too much about the family, that she was a snoop who always had her ear to the door. I'd say to Enna, "Why do you stay?" And she'd say, "I stay because the children want me to stay." She did treat the children very nicely. She was bound and determined to stay until the day she died, because Senator Kennedy had helped bring her into the country, and she felt she owed him her life. Now, just as a side note, in truth, I think that Ethel was a terrible person. If you have any questions about that, go watch last time's episode, in which just impersonating her scared me during the editing. And I think that having to work for a woman like that would have been more trying than one could even verbalize. However, if you do choose to stay somewhere and you do understand the hierarchy, you're really not making your life or anybody else's life better by this Cold War where you're constantly undermining the woman who's hired you and you're constantly sort of stirring up trouble and creating drama. There's already enough drama. So if you want to stay and you want to stay in the memory of the employer who you really loved and because of the children, then do so in good faith, not because you enjoy watching somebody flounder. I think it would have been so easy to hate Ethel. Just reading about Ethel makes me strongly dislike her. But I think that if you were employed by her, you understood the agreement. She's a very difficult person. She's not a lovely person to work for. And then you need to put yourself under the submission of that authority instead of kind of wandering around creating drama where you can. So I think that Ethel is probably awful to Enna because we've seen her be awful to everybody. But I think that Enna enjoyed knowing that she was favored among the children, and I think she stayed for her own ego, not because she cared so much that Mr. Kennedy had gotten her into the country, because good for him for getting you your green card and getting you into the country, but he has passed on now. So if you feel that there was a loyalty to him and that you're required to stay because of that, I'm sorry, that excuse just doesn't hold up to me. He's not here anymore, so you don't have to give him your life. His life is over, so you can move on if you would like to. I just think the dynamic gave her a sense of power and prestige over a woman who socially, if you were going to draw it out, was higher on the ladder socially than you. But of course, you were more powerful in her own house because her children loved you. It's kind of messy. I mean, it's definitely messy. I don't know that either of the women were acting in a way that was the most honoring to their dignity. But anyway, the book goes on to say that Richard Burke, Ted Kennedy's personal assistant in the mid-70s, was also aware of the conflict. Enna really called the shots, he said later. She was the one everybody always went to. Nobody went to Ethel. Enna was the person who was always there for the kids. I never saw the kids running up to their mother. They always went to Enna first. The older kids shied away from Ethel, avoiding her like the plague. So Enna was really the center for the children. She also knew everything that was going on in the house. She was aware of all of it. Some members of the Hickory Hill staff felt Enna had become as autocratic and critical as the actual mistress of the house. Not long after Noelle Fell was hired, Ethel told her, "It won't be long now before she's gone. I'm fed up with her." But Joe, in his mid-20s, interceded on Enna's behalf. On one occasion, Noelle overheard an argument between mother and son. "You can't get rid of her," Joe beseeched. "We all love her." "This is my house, and I'll do what I want," his mother screeched. But in fact, she had conflicting feelings about Enna. Mrs. Kennedy would get upset with herself and say, "I don't know why I just don't get rid of her, but the kids like her," said Fell. She kind of took out the animosity she had towards Enna on the others who worked at Hickory Hill. There was a tremendously talented laundress, who also was a wonderful seamstress who would work down in the basement all day and come up only for lunch. All she did was wash, iron, but Mrs. Kennedy was always so offensive to the woman that it came to the point that the woman would ask me to bring the things upstairs because she refused to have an encounter with Mrs. Kennedy. It was people like her who took the brunt of Mrs. Kennedy's feelings toward Enna. Because of Ethel's behavior, morale at Hickory Hill in the 70s was at its lowest ebb. Ted Kennedy had asked Richard Burke to give Ethel as much help as he could with staffing and organization, but Burke soon threw up his hands in despair. There was a period of time when she was going through new people every week, Burke said. She was unable to deal with hiring people, and I was interviewing people for her. It got totally out of control. The house was in chaos. She was in chaos. Finally, I just said, I can't help you anymore. It had become difficult for Ethel to get help because stories about the household's turmoil had become known. A Chevy Chase employment agency manager recalled one experience ruefully. He said, I remember sending a cook to Ethel's house. And I remember the woman coming into the office not long after, pulling her hair out and saying, I just can't go back there again. It's constant chaos. That woman with all her kids and all her dogs is absolutely insane. I just can't take it. I can't take it. I really thought she was going to have a breakdown. The woman was a wonderful cook who couldn't believe it when Ethel demanded that a variety of inappropriate sauces be served with different dishes. I couldn't help but laugh. This woman was an artist in the kitchen, and she couldn't believe how someone like Ethel could have such bad taste in food. After all that hell we were put through, Ethel never paid the agency its fee. Color none of us shocked. Things got so bad that Ethel was forced to resort to running blind advertisements in the employment section of the Washington Post. Paul Nass, a young chef, had the misfortune to answer one of those classifieds. He called and was invited to Hickory Hill, where one of Ethel's secretaries begged him to take the job. They were so desperate. The last cook had quit only after a month. Like so many others before him, Nass was excited by the prospect of working for Ethel Kennedy, despite warnings that it could be hell, and that he'd be on call 24 hours a day. A lot of people who go to work out there are just like me. They all hope they'll meet Ted Kennedy, and he'll say, Hi, won't you come work in the White House? Nass lasted exactly 12 hours, from 7:30 in the morning until 7:30 that night, when he threw off his apron and told one of Ethel's children, Tell your mommy I said bye. Now, he must have really wanted that job, because this job paid $180 a week for 6 days, 12-hour shifts each. That comes to $2.50 an hour. Now, I know this was the 70s, and I know that inflation rates are taking us all down to our graves. But I think even then, $2.50 an hour as a personal chef was a pittance. All right? Okay, but in this one day that he worked, the book says that during the time he was there, he had been forced to cook breakfast after breakfast after breakfast for Ethel and each one of her 6 Kennedy children who were home that day. The only words he heard directly from Ethel were, Hi, close the door, and Who dared park in my spot? When the family wasn't around, staff members sat in a circle and bemoaned their fate. Between complaints, they offered Nass tips. He should always have a good supply of cold Heineken beer at the ready for Ethel after she got off the tennis court. And while the children always got plastic utensils and paper plates, their mother required a pink linen napkin and a placemat to match the dining room's draperies and paint. By lunchtime, Nass was still serving breakfast. Looking ahead towards dinner, he noticed the only meat in the freezer was pork chops, that the cupboards contained little more than Duncan Hines cake mix. By late afternoon, Ethel had still not given him the dinner menu. She said she was having a network TV executive over and wanted a fancy roast or steak. While she pondered a menu, she suggested that Nass make her a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich as a snack. Each of the children then demanded a BLT too. They should raise pigs out there, Nass said later. They eat so many BLTs. Finally, Ethel set down her dinner instructions on a note card engraved with her name. She instructed the chef to serve up the plates of caviar, and, if there was none, to have Governor, another servant, run out and buy some. After reading Ethel's note, Nass took his leave, thinking they ought to call that place Horror Hill, not Hickory Hill. He never returned. A few days later, another blind ad for a cook appeared in the newspaper. How could you, at that late date, knowing you were having dinner guests, not make sure that somebody went to the store? Because there's only pork chops and Duncan Hines cake mix in the house. And you're going to have somebody over for dinner that night? But nobody's bothered to make sure that there are groceries? I mean, I can't imagine working in a place like that at all. Because even if it was running well, even if there was regular groceries and things were organized, just trying to keep up with the demands of that many kids, that many adults, this many parties, would be work enough of its own. but then try to do that on top of chaos, confusion, nothing's ready, nothing's prepared, but there's so much staff. That's the thing that continues to blow my mind. How can there be so much staff, but nothing is run properly? This would be the ultimate nightmare. In the years after Bobby's death, the house he loved had become a smelly zoo. The dogs roamed freely indoors, urinating and defecating on the rugs and furniture with abandon. There was even poop from the turtle Carruthers on the rugs, said a frequent visitor. Bobby Jr. had brought home the enormous turtle from Kenya in hopes of winning the biggest turtle prize at the annual pet show at Hickory Hill, which Ethel was still throwing as if nothing had changed. When Carruthers died, Bobby put him in chronic suspension in a basement freezer. As a Christmas gift one year, Lem Billings gave Ethel a baby pig, whom she named Billings, and whom she allowed to run loose in the house, making a mess and leaving a horrible smell. Ethel finally gave Enna the responsibility of making certain the little porker was fed and taken outside. They tried to feed it on the patio and make it go to the bathroom outside, said Noelle Fell. It was winter time, and about 2 weeks after Ethel got the pig, someone left it outside one night and forgot it, and the next morning they found it frozen. I'm not sure whoever left the pig there didn't do it on purpose. Mrs. Kennedy should have given it away, but instead it died. Ethel was furious. She demanded to know who was responsible for leaving Billings outside. But, not surprisingly, nobody fessed up. You guys, I need more vocabulary to express the way I feel about this. Utterly speechless. How? I just don't understand. I don't understand. If I was having people over to my house constantly and continually, and I had the staff to make sure my house was clean, you better believe it would be. I cannot even imagine inviting people over to my house, using my house as a staging place for parties and events and hosting all of this stuff. Yet there are packs of dogs running through the atmosphere, peeing, pooping. By the way, I've seen turtle poop. It's like a human being has defecated. There's this really horribly sad little clunky pet shop in Birmingham, Alabama in Homewood. I have no idea how come it hasn't been torn down. I don't know what's going on over there. And every time that I'm in Homewood with my kids, they want to go to this little pet store, which I've agreed to, but every time I go in, I'm like, why? And they have an enormous turtle in there that goes to the bathroom on the floors. It's a horrible place. It should be shut down. It goes to the bathroom on the floors. And the first time I saw it, I thought, this place is grim enough. That has somebody wandered in here and just, in the corner over here, just thought it was the bathroom. I mean, it's a horrible place. If a turtle was, a huge, gigantic turtle is just going on the floor, that's not a minor incident. Let me just tell you, in case you've never encountered the horrible thing in your life. And if that's the case, I'm so happy for you. If you've ever encountered a giant turtle's poop, it's shocking in its abundance. Anyway, the house is utter chaos. And I really feel like it speaks to who Ethel has become. Chaotic, confused, mentally ill. These conditions sound like the conditions of a person who is mentally ill, that they would be able to live and function in this. I don't think that people who are functioning well would find this a place that they could inhabit with any kind of peace. Anyway, the book goes on to say that a beautiful oriental rug, a gift from the Shah of Iran, was thrown into the basement. Stained with dog wee-wee, one of Ethel's friends recalled. Noelle Fell said the dogs also went under the table in the dining room during the now infrequent dinner parties that Ethel threw. Well, they've become infrequent for a reason, probably. They would go doo-doo. No one would dare say anything to Mrs. Kennedy, who would try to cover up the mess with her foot, but everyone could smell it. During a dinner party, Ethel, the dog literally went and relieved itself at the feet of your guests. And then you try to put your foot over it like that's going to help the situation. That's just going to smash it and the smell will emanate. Grossness. It's like peak grossness. Peak grossness. Sitting there eating a meal with the dogs defecating at your feet and your hostess is smashing it down with her foot because that's going to help it? In the kitchen, the appliances had become outdated, and the tile floor was worn through to the wood beneath. The immense commercial stove and grill was old and dirty. The insides of the kitchen cabinets were filled with crumbs, grease, and grime. The two big refrigerators and an ice maker creaked and groaned. One summer, Ethel invited her pal Liz Stevens to stay at Hickory Hill while she was at the Cape. Stevens, who lived in Georgetown, immediately accepted the gracious invitation, which would permit her and her children to swim in the Kennedy pool and play tennis on the Kennedy court. I have to stop the reading again. You guys, would any of you invite people into your home? First of all, none of you live like this, okay? But let's just put ourselves in this situation. Your house is covered in feces, urine, everything's torn up, dirty, and broken. And you decide to extend an invitation to a friend to come stay in the squalor while you are at Cape Cod. Ethel has lost her mind. I'm legitimately being serious here. I think she'd lost her mind. I think she had completely and totally lost her mind. Well, her friend brought all of her clothes, and she brought all of her own beautiful pots and pans and a beautiful polished stainless steel salmon poacher because she didn't want to use Ethel's kitchenware, said Noelle Fell. She said, I refuse to use hers. This stuff is so dirty I can't stand it. I don't know how Ethel can live here. If I was living here, my staff would have to clean this mess up. How come they don't do this? I said, they're very busy. They're always busy, and Mrs. Kennedy has never said anything. She said, I can't stand it. It's a wonder this place is not full of roaches. Mrs. Stevens got very upset because the kitchen looked like it was in a poorly run restaurant. If it had been inspected, it would have been condemned. Liz being Liz, she just said to her husband, I can't stand it. We're going to have to get a crew to come in here and clean. I'm not moving in here. Bring my clothes back home, and I'll come back in a few days. The Stevenses brought in a crew to clean up. They even put new paper in the cabinets and had everything that Liz didn't have any use for taken out and boxed. She did the same thing in Mrs. Kennedy's bedroom. Her bedroom wasn't dirty, but it wasn't up to Liz's standards either. After a week before Ethel got home, Liz had the staff put everything back the way that it was and took her own things home. She would never have said anything to Ethel, and she knew that we wouldn't tell. Mrs. Kennedy never knew what happened. Did she not notice when she came home that the place didn't reek of feces, that the kitchen was clean, and that there wasn't grease caking everything? But, just what a weird situation. Your friend comes over and stays at your house, and then a crew completely clean the house, and she boxes up all your stuff while she's, living there, and she has the gall to criticize you, even though she's living in your house. And she comes and she inspects it, and she's grossed out by the way that you live, and she's criticizing you, your staff, and she's asking what in the world is all of this, which it's like, Liz, didn't you know? You've been here multiple times. You know how it is. You accepted the invitation in the full knowledge that you were coming to this hovel. But then you want to come in and say, I have to get a crew to clean up. This is disgusting. How come nobody works around here? Which are all questions we're asking, but we also didn't agree to stay in the place that we know is filthy and disgusting. It just is kind of rich to me that Liz would sit here and condemn and criticize, yet she was fully willing to accept the invitation to stay at this mansion, in Northern Virginia. She's fully willing to accept so that she can swim in the pool and play on the tennis court. It's just weird to me. I don't understand this entire echelon of people. And that Ethel could think that she should invite a friend to this filth and that her friend would want to live in her squalor. I mean, Ethel must just not notice it anymore. Maybe she's just lived in the filth for so long that she doesn't even realize. But she goes out in the world, doesn't she? Doesn't she notice that the rest of the world isn't caked in grease? Dog feces? Urine? Okay, anyway. Apparently, it wasn't just Hickory Hill that was a hot mess. Conditions in Ethel's house and the compound were not much different. The pets ran wild and made messes, and the place needed major repairs. One of the men whom he used for handiwork went over there, and he could see the sky through the roof when he was in the attic, recalled Barbara Gibson. Because Ethel was short of funds, she couldn't afford to pay for the repairs, or didn't care to. I think that's the option. Gibson mentioned the situation to Kennedy's nephew, Joe Garrigan, in hopes of getting financial help from the park agency. Garrigan also sent an appeal to all the family members. It had words to the effect that here is the widow of Bobby Kennedy, the senator from New York and presidential candidate, who has holes in the roof of her house so that the rain comes through, and you can see the sky, recalled Gibson. The only one who called was Jackie, and she told him, Joe, I'll buy Ethel a new roof. This is ridiculous. And she did. Ethel got a new roof courtesy of Jackie. Well, Jackie's got some relatives of her own who are also living in squalor, so maybe this is just par for the course. Well, Jackie felt compassion for Ethel and was willing to come to her aid financially. She decided to keep her distance socially. At one event at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, reporters noted that Ethel and Jackie had arrived separately and never spoke to each other. When photographers pressed Ethel to pose for a picture with Jackie, she replied that she felt the crowds were too big, and it would be impossible for them to get together. Jackie's whispered response was drowned out by the loud music. The two women, wrote a Washington Post reporter, never managed to exchange even a smile through the mobs. Several days later, though, the Washington Post ran a correction stating that the sisters-in-law did meet and exchange greetings and kisses. I don't know if any of that's true. But when you're rich and famous, you can pay for certain stories in the papers. Jackie had made it a strict rule not to allow Caroline and John Jr. to fraternize with their Hickory Hill cousins. Wise move. That became very clear when Ethel extended an invitation to her niece and nephew to come and stay for a couple of weeks. Jackie said, "No way," recalled Richard Burke. He said that Caroline had previously spent some time there. But with all that stuff going on Hickory Hill, especially with the problems that the boys were having, Jackie just didn't want Caroline and John there. Yeah, she probably also did not want them to get the plague. Jackie wasn't the only member of the clan who was wary of the happenings at Hickory Hill. Ethel's sister-in-law, Eunice, also kept Ethel's children at arm's length. One afternoon, Burke said he was driving Maria Shriver, Caroline Kennedy, and Sidney Lawford to the Shrivers' Maryland estate, Timberlawn, and the girls were talking about the family, especially the Bobby Kennedy branch. They were saying what a mess they all were, and how their mothers wouldn't let them go near Hickory Hill. There was definitely a hands-off attitude on the part of those three mothers, Eunice, Jackie, and Pat. And in other circumstances, I would be inclined to say, oh, that's too bad, Jackie and Eunice and Pat, they should have orchestrated some way for those poor fatherless children to have family in their lives. But on the other hand, we have to have some self-preservation here. And it isn't as though they were just these poor fatherless children who, had hearts of gold. Their mother's crazy. They live in a zoo. And the children didn't necessarily seem, though I can't speak for all 11 of them, the boys at least were wild and were happy to be so. And I know that a lot of that came from being unloved and unnoticed, and it was their way of trying to get some attention from the adults. And so I don't fault them for being wild, but I can also see why these three mothers just thought it's just easier for you not to go over there. It's just too crazy. And probably it was safer not to let them go, considering the fact that the place is swimming in feces. Okay, but that leads us into this next chapter entitled Bad Boys. Without Bobby at the helm, Ethel's life had spun out of control. Yeah, to put it mildly. The ongoing mayhem at Hickory Hill was only one reflection of her inner chaos. Another sign, far worse, was the way her relationship with her three older sons was deteriorated. If she wasn't having screaming matches with them, she was ordering them out of the house. All semblance of parental authority had vanished. Ethel had a knack for throwing the kids out, said Patricia Seton Lawford. Peter and I would be sitting at home in our bathrobes, and the doorbell would ring, and it would be Bobby. Peter Lawford eagerly shared with Bobby his own favorite pastimes, getting stoned and hanging out at Hugh Hefner's place, surrounded by willing women. What a sad, sad, sad life that Bobby had. Defiant and angry, struggling with intolerable loss, Bobby and David intensified their drug use. While Joe stayed with marijuana, Bobby and David had begun moving into the danger areas, popping pills, snorting cocaine, and shooting heroin. Just 2 weeks after Bobby's year-long probation from his 1970 marijuana bust ended, he was arrested in Hyannis after a run-in with the police. Patrolman Frederick Ahern had asked the 17-year-old Kennedy to move along because his car was blocking traffic. Bobby, sitting with the girl, refused to budge. Noticing that the boy's eyes were bloodshot, the officer asked the long-haired, grubby-looking teenager whether he was drunk. According to Ahern, Bobby answered no and then spat at him. In court, he claimed the officer was lying, pleaded no contest to the charge of loitering, and paid a $50 fine. Bobby and Joe also had a series of motor vehicle incidents. In the same month, Joe had an accident on the West Coast, and his brother was cited for speeding on the East Coast. Bobby had spent his senior year at the Palfrey School in Watertown, Massachusetts, and Lem Billings had made arrangements for him to live at the home of friends, the Broad family. The woman of the house, Joey Broad, a school teacher, said that the entire year Bobby stayed with her family, Ethel had never once called to inquire about her son. "I never knew Ethel," she said later. "Bobby never talked about his mother. It's certainly true that they were alienated. I was like a parent to him. The one thing that I tried to do, and it seemed to be successful, was to feed him. I loved to cook, and he loved to eat. One of the things that happened that year that really was quite wonderful was that he gradually became very much a part of our family. When he came to live with us, he was the type who would grab food and run. Here he was able to relax and eat dinner with us and have conversations. It was a nice thing because there was a lot of tension in Bobby, caused by the death of his father and by the attentiveness of the press and the difficulties of being young. He was finally able to relax with our family. During the time Bobby lived with the Broads, he had stopped using drugs and had not gotten into trouble. But once he returned to his mother's jurisdiction, the problem started all over again. Because, quite frankly, if any of us were in that situation, what coping mechanisms would we reach for? That summer at Hickory Hill, he and David grew a marijuana patch that was discovered by Richard Burke as he was helping to get the grounds ready for Ethel's annual pet show. Ethel's secretary, Caroline Croft, told Burke, "They grow it all the time and smoke it." In the fall, as a freshman at Harvard, Bobby had been arrested for driving 65 miles an hour in a 35-mile zone in Waterville, New Hampshire, where the Kennedys skied. He failed to show up in court, pleaded guilty, and paid a $30 fine. His brother Joe, meanwhile, had collided with a car in a busy Berkeley, California intersection and then struck a second vehicle. Joe's head hit the windshield, causing minor chest, skull, and neck injuries. Joe had just arrived in Berkeley after a couple of months at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. After some psychiatric counseling, he dropped out of MIT, feeling he needed to distance himself from the Klan. Never a particularly good student, Joe had gone to Milton Academy, his father's alma mater, for a time, but was forced by poor grades to leave before graduation, eventually earning his high school diploma from the Manor Hall Tutoring School in Cambridge. He'd worked for a time in his Uncle Ted's 1970 Senate re-election campaign and for the RFK Memorial. In February 1972, Joe had accompanied his mother and uncle to Bangladesh, but refused to return home with them. Instead, he bought a motorcycle and rode through the central states of India. He was on a flight headed home when 5 Palestinian terrorists hijacked the plane, rigged the aircraft with explosives, and held Joe and other passengers hostage for 18 hours. "It wasn't the worst moment of my life," he said at the time. He also stated, "I've been scared before, but it never lasted as long." Every single one of these kids could write a bestseller. Arrangements were then made by Ethel and Ted to enroll the troubled and aimless young man at the University of California at Berkeley. He registered for only a few courses but rarely attended classes. Joe spent most of his time watching TV in his room at the home of Diane Clemens, a Berkeley history professor who found him erratic and obnoxious, often breaking house rules by smuggling in girls. More worrisome for Clemens was the time Joe threatened to kill her 11-year-old daughter after the youngster had mischievously locked him in his room. The husky 6-footer angrily smashed his way out and chased the child, threatening her. Well, all in a day at Hickory Hill. That's what he'd come from. He later apologized profusely. On one occasion, he mysteriously disappeared for a couple of days. Clemens got word to the Kennedys, who instructed her to look for him but warned her not to call the police, fearful of the publicity. Joe never revealed where he had been. When Ethel learned that Joe had dropped out of Berkeley altogether, she had Ted use his influence with San Francisco Mayor Joseph Alito to give her son an $8,976 a year job in a federally funded program to control TB and VD in black neighborhoods. The hiring sparked anger from at least one San Francisco supervisor who questioned the 20-year-old's qualifications for the job. Yeah, for real. What does he know about controlling TB and VD? But Alito, a longtime Kennedy ally, said that he stood firmly behind hiring, saying that he was impressed with Joe. Young Joe sounded like a veteran politician when a reporter asked him about his controversial job. "You realize the mistrust of higher officials and what government is doing among these people," he said. "They see countless programs being cut by the Nixon administration and feel helpless." Despite the smooth patter, Joe quickly lost interest in the job and quit. He'd been in Berkeley only a few short months when he told Diane Clemens he was returning to Boston. Clemens tried her best to get him to stay, concerned that he'd hurt himself or someone else if he didn't pull himself together. Several months later, back east on Nantucket, on a muggy August afternoon, her fears became reality. A Jeep Joe was driving overturned, leaving 18-year-old Pam Kelly, a close pal of the Kennedy kids, paralyzed from the chest down. Joe had been cutting through the woods, spinning the Jeep in circles. Everyone was acting crazy, Kelly recalled later. Joe swerved suddenly to avoid an oncoming car. The Jeep flipped, landing in a ditch, and tossing all 6 occupants to the ground. 18-year-old David, who worshipped his older brother, was also hurt. He suffered a fractured vertebrae and had to be placed in traction. The doctors prescribed morphine to kill the pain, and David took as much as he could get. 3 other friends, including Pam's sister and another girl, the daughter of a New York Times reporter, suffered minor injuries. Pam, the most critically injured, would never walk again. And if you need more information about that, you can go back to our coverage of Ask Not, and you can read the whole section all about Pam. And you can listen to those episodes because they really do give a startling picture of what poor Pam went through. A week after the accident, 21-year-old Joe Kennedy was found guilty of negligent driving, a misdemeanor, carrying a maximum jail term of up to 2 years, a $300 fine, or both. Joe, who pleaded innocent and did not testify, was let off with a $100 fine and a brief scolding by a judge, who'd been a friend of his father's and had gone to college with his late Uncle Joe Kennedy, Jr. To many family critics, it was Chappaquiddick all over again. I would hope that you would use your illustrious name as an example that could be an asset to the young people of your age instead of becoming involved in cases that bring you into court, said Nantucket Judge C. George Anastas. I knew your father in Washington. We did not always agree on matters, but he was a fine man. You have a fine mother. You have a fine mother, this judge says to Joe. I believe that his title should have been revoked based on that judgment alone. You have a fine mother. Ethel's eyes filled with tears when the judge, who had been an attorney for Joe McCarthy in the Army McCarthy hearings, mentioned Bobby. Joe, whose relationship with his mother had never been worse, played the loving son for the reporters, who packed the courtroom, leaning over and kissing her on the cheek after hearing the sentence. But throughout the 3-hour trial, mother and son, Ted and Steve Smith, had sat emotionless as prosecution witnesses, such as Sandra Peterson, a tour bus driver, took the stand. She told the court she came upon the accident scene, saw bodies lying all over, and spoke to Joe, who said, "It was all my fault." Ethel never liked the now paralyzed Pam Kelly, daughter of a bartender whose home was located near the Kennedy compound. Ethel had always suspected that Pam and her sister had tried to seduce her sons. But after the accident that garnered front-page headlines for weeks, and before the settlement, Ethel had suddenly began showering attention on the Kelly girl. Ethel visited Pam every day at the hospital, once with Rose Kennedy at her side. Ethel brought Pam flowers, straightened her room, and every night had a first-run movie shown there. Knowing Ethel's past feelings, those around Pam questioned her sincerity. Pam later told writers Peter Collier and David Horowitz, "Everybody would gather there, even the nurses. While they were watching, I'd ease into the wheelchair that I was trying to get used to and go out in the hall and smoke a cigarette while they watched the film. They never missed me." 2 years later, the Kennedys settled with the Kelly family for nearly $1 million. For Ethel, it was all like a bad dream, recalled George Terrian of that period in the 70s. Ethel refused to admit to herself that her boys were boozing and using drugs. She just felt that they were bad boys who wouldn't listen to her, just like her brothers, who had disobeyed Big Ann. Kids were out of control all over the country, but Ethel had closed her eyes to all of it. It was easier for her to throw them out of the house or turn them over to Teddy or that Billings character. After Chappaquiddick, Teddy had enough problems keeping himself under control, and we all thought Billings was a deviant. Ethel washed her hands of those boys, but that was typical Skakel. Ignore the 2,000-pound elephant in your living room. By the time David recovered from the injuries he had sustained in the Jeep accident and returned to boarding school, he considered himself a chipper. Street talk for a heroin user who believed he could take the drug or leave it. In actuality, he was hooked. A couple of months before graduation, as part of his senior project, Ethel and Ted arranged for David to take a part-time job in Nashville at the Tennessean, published by a family friend, John Siegenthaler. The very Siegenthaler who saw Ethel berate and physically abuse that staff member. David showed up looking like a junkie. Another young man recovering from a drug problem, John Warnecke, whose father had designed Jack's grave at Arlington National Cemetery, was also in Nashville at Siegenthaler's invitation, and the two young men became friends. Warnecke's clearest recollection of David was how, when he took off his jacket, syringes and packets of white powder fell out of the pockets like loose change. We'd talk, and he'd say how the family treated him so badly. He was the one taking the heat from Ethel. It became clear that he thought of himself, and in fact was, what they call in family therapy, the designated sick one. The one whose sickness allows everyone else to feel healthy by comparison. The only real joy Ethel experienced during this period was the marriage of her firstborn, and even that happy occasion was marred. An hour before 22-year-old Radcliffe senior Kathleen said her vows with 25-year-old Harvard graduate student David Lee Townsend at Holy Trinity Church on November 17, 1973, Ted's 12-year-old son, Teddy Jr., was having his cancerous right leg amputated at nearby Georgetown University Hospital. Ethel knew the operation was scheduled but had refused to cancel the long-planned wedding. A grim-faced Ted, still desperately trying to play the role of surrogate father to Ethel's brood, bravely came to the church immediately after his son's surgery, leaving Joan at the boy's bedside. We have to stop there, which means we won't get into zany Playgirl. But you guys, I'm still trying to digest what I just read. All of the mess at the house, and then all of the mess with the boys. Hot mess everywhere you look. Hot garbage juice steaming out of the life of Ethel. And I'm just trying to figure out how anybody let her go on like this without saying she needs to be institutionalized for just a little bit. Let's try to get her under control. Because it would appear that every single aspect of her life was fraught with chaos. It doesn't seem like there was just even one place in her life where I was like, okay, well, this is out of control and that's a lot of control. But Ethel is letting us know that she's okay because she's tracking right over here. Ethel's not tracking anywhere. Ethel's off the rails in every direction. Her kids are a mess. Her house is a mess. Her social life is in a mess. She's not having the parties that she used to have because her house is a mess, because her kids are a mess. Like, everything is entwined together in the gigantic ball of chaos. Meanwhile, she's screaming, hitting people, cursing people out. And I think the thing that is so astounding to me is that Ethel, who was surrounded by so many people that she said were her friends, appears to have no real friends now that we've come to it. Nobody was willing to do anything but cover up for her and cover up for her and cover up for her. Meanwhile, she's got 11 children who are witnesses to the mental breakdown of their mother. But no one can lift a finger to get anybody out of this. It's just, well, let's just not let our kids go over there. Well, we just won't go to that party. Well, that's Ethel. And meanwhile, all of these lives are being disassembled because nobody will finally say, Ethel needs help. She needs an intervention. Someone needs to help her. And I know that we live in a time now that is just fraught with therapies and interventions, and everybody needs to go and get their mental health evaluated. But I think that even in an era when everyone wasn't at a therapist, it should have been glaringly obvious that she desperately needed to sit down for some psychotherapy or something, because she does not know what to do next. And if the feces under the dining room table isn't enough of a message to tell you that the lady's out to lunch, what message do we need? We are being assaulted by our noses, our eyes, our ears as she screeches and screams at everyone. What message were people looking for? So, I don't know, you guys. That was a crazy episode. That might have been one of the craziest ones we've read so far, which is hard to say because we've read a lot of weird things. But stick with me, because the next time we're going to be reading about the zany playgirl. That's Ethel trying to get all of her adult friends into vandalizing equipment and people's lawns and houses. So that's a crazy chapter. And then the one after that is about Martha Moxley. So we're not done yet. Crazyville is still open and we're still reading about it. Later this week, I am going to be doing a couple of videos about some pop culture reactions. You guys have seen some of those lately. I'm trying to fit some of those in. The algorithm likes those videos better than books about me reading. So as I build the channel, we're going to see more and more videos that are just me reacting to pop culture things. And I do want to get into the Blake Lively stuff later this week. I'm glad I've sat on it because there's just so much coming out, but also it's kind of confusing. And I would like to sit with you guys and maybe we can break down the chaos. I think both of those people are villains. Both of them are manipulative. But I do think that there is one person in that whole scenario who's going to come out on top, and I'd like to talk to you guys about it. So we'll see. We shall see. Anyway, I'll see you guys later this week. We'll be reading the book. We'll be talking about pop culture. We'll be doing all the things we do over here. But thank you so much for keeping me company, and I'll see you later. Bye.